Does doing the right thing come at the cost of business performance? Can ethics and profit coexist? Welcome to the Human Conversation podcast. Join host Kaumadi Gowda for candid conversations with industry luminaries as we navigate the maze of decision-making in today's global workplace. Each episode offers a window into the minds of leaders achieving remarkable outcomes while balancing diverse priorities and stakeholders. Tune in for thought-provoking insights and actionable strategies on leading with ethics every day. Because in the pursuit of excellence, integrity matters.
Dr. Isabel de Bruin Cardso works at the intersection of research, teaching, and practice with a focus on ethics in non-profit organizations. Drawing on 20 years of experience in more than 25 countries, she helps nonprofits and founders strengthen their ethical leadership, culture, and decision-making while staying aligned with their values in complex and real-world contexts. In academia, Isabel researches and teaches behavioral ethics. In consulting, she advises boards and executive teams and facilitates strategic and technical dialogues that foster trust and critical reflection on values, policies, structures, and impact. Her work has been published in peer-reviewed journals, practitioner outlets, and the media, and she's a regular voice on ethics safeguarding and non-profit accountability in podcasts and radio. Passionate about shaping non-profit ethics as a defined and practiced field, Isabel collaborates with organizations and peers to turn ethical aspirations into everyday practice. A very warm welcome to you, Dr. de Bruin Cardso. I have been waiting and looking forward to this conversation. I'm fascinated by the work you do. So thank you so much for joining us today and for giving us your time.
Thank you so much, KG. Really looking forward to our conversation. And thanks also for the invitation to be part of your platform.
So you've had such an interesting career: research, education, consulting across the world, to name just a few. Is there a red thread that ties all of it together for you? What's the driving force behind all that you do?
That's an interesting question. Not one of these people that had a dream when I was a child to become what I am now. I think a lot of where I am now was based on always a drive to be involved with human rights, not necessarily only from a legal rights perspective, but more human rights as a principle as well. But the different stages and phases of my life have also been shaped a lot by circumstance, by people, and by opportunity. After my master's in 2007 in the United States, I moved to South Africa. And that's where my career started, working first in the University of Pretoria at that point, and then morphing along as a staff member of various NGOs, a consultancy, to where I am now.
Well, I love that. One of the things that I'm, of course, fascinated about is your focus on area of ethics and in specifically in the nonprofit sector. And I remember distinctly, Isabel, when I fell in love with it. I was a newly minted lawyer, just finished law school. And, you know, in New York, there is a 8-hour bar license exam that you have to take. It's this huge hall, so many aspiring lawyers who take the exam. And then on a separate day, there is an ethics exam. And I remember feeling so buzzed by the preparation for the ethics exam and actually writing it. It just struck such strong chord in me. It spoke to me. And over the years, my involvement in specifically that area has evolved and it's become much stronger and more aligned. But looking back, I knew there was something special there. You know, given all the research that you do and the super important work that you've undertaken in this field, I want to ask you, what do the terms ethics and integrity mean to you?
Well, firstly, also thank you for sharing your story about the exams as a lawyer. And I find it really interesting that there was also an ethics component to it. As we know, ethics is not the same as law, and ethics is also not the same as compliance. So it was really intrigued to hear that there was also an element of ethics in your exam. How I look at ethics versus integrity, I think that ethics is like the framework. That's really kind of like the, if you will, the North Star, the moral compass of what we stand for. As individuals, these can be our values, or also as an organization. So ethics would be what is incorporated into a code of conduct, or let's say safeguarding policy, a human right or human resources policy. Integrity is the implementation thereof. So it's really practicing what you preach. So without ethics, you can still have integrity, but you're not necessarily having that North Star guiding you. And without integrity, you can have ethics, but then you're not implementing your ethics. So that's how I look at it. Ethics really kind of as an overarching guiding principle, if you will, and integrity, the implementation of it.
I love the pragmatic, nuanced perspective on it, because most people sort of differentiate it as technicality and rules versus, in a sense, of values. I love that you're pointing out that one cannot function well without the other. They both need to be in confluence, in harmony, for things to be effective. Beautiful. Thank you. What can you share with me about how you make that make personal sense to you? Is there a personal story, for example, when you yourself felt tested on these two issues of ethics or integrity? And more importantly, I feel like there's always a learning with any big challenge. So however the outcome of that story might be, I'd love to hear what you learned from it and what you adjusted going forward.
Yeah, of course, many ethical dilemmas, both professionally and personally, have come along my path. I suppose one concrete one was when I was doing my PhD. A PhD is a journey in and of itself, not just from an academic perspective, but also from a personal perspective. And in the beginning of the PhD, my father got quite ill and at some point passed away. And that ethical dilemma of who am I responsible for? I'm responsible for my mother. I'm responsible also for my children who lost their grandfather. But I'm also responsible for my PhD supervisors who have been investing in me. So I think ethics, especially with respect to dilemmas, is thinking through how will a decision impact on the people or the stakeholders around you. Ethical dilemmas and making decisions around them are tough. It's never win-win. So being very conscious of the so-called moral remainder or the moral impact of our decisions. I think with respect to how I approach ethical dilemmas, to the extent that I have the luxury of time, is to think about it, to take the time to think about it. Try and get as much information, perspectives as I can in order to make as informed possible decision as much as possible. And also being very conscious to kind of reflect on what the outcome of that decision is. I mean, we are human beings at the end of the day, and we can all make wrong decisions, but being conscious of maybe adjusting if I made a wrong decision or apologizing if I made a wrong decision, but also just being conscious to reflect on decisions, not just like, okay, now I move on with this. Ethical dilemma also in terms of work, and I'm sure this might resonate with some of your listeners, is and going back to your question as well as about ethics and integrity, working in an organization, especially these organizations that are perceived as morally good, like NGOs, and there's also this belief that people are good people in the organization, but then also seeing that is not necessarily always the case. So I have witnessed this several times in some of the organizations that I worked for. But then the dilemma is, what do you say and how do you say it and to whom do you say it? And yes, I suppose we are talking about whistleblowing now, but that dilemma also of the uncertainty of not knowing how that will impact you. So the ethical dilemma of speak up or not, because you're unaware of the consequences of it. And I think that experience led me to also do a PhD in the sense of how can we explain both kind of that goodness of these organizations as well as the fact that they can behave unethically. So a lot of the PhD was based on kind of personal experience and witnessing both the good and the bad and trying to make sense of, because if we expect an organization, for example, to be good, we expect them to also behave in line with their expectations. And when they don't, it becomes confusing and maybe psychologically uncomfortable as well. So how can we make sense of that? And so I guess the ethical dilemmas that I've seen at work can also encouraged me to undertake a PhD on this topic.
Oh, that's so deep. I mean, you can tell when the conversation is with someone who's an expert, because I love those are really big, paralyzing questions that many people grapple with. So you started off by talking about uncertainty a leader might face and having time constraints as well. As a PhD candidate, you had important choices to make that must have felt heavy in terms of responsibility. You also didn't have the luxury of forever. You couldn't take 2 years to recover from grief and process it and then make the decision. You had to also process and also make decisions at the same time, which is perhaps a very real world scenario. A lot of leaders might be uncertain about which is the right path and also have time crunch, not just uncertainty, but scarcity of time too. And what I thought I heard you, and please correct me if I'm wrong, what I thought I heard you say is let's acknowledge both exist, pick a path after considering all your stakeholders, all of the important factors, and instead of getting paralyzed by it, choose a path and then make that reflect on those decisions. It might be sometimes a wrong decision. It might sometimes have been perhaps you need to backtrack and make another decision, and that's fine. But making peace with the fact that maybe there is no 100% clarity possible, picking a path after doing as much analysis as possible. Perhaps what you've said, Isabel, helps people sort of not be paralyzed anymore about, oh my goodness, I have to somehow find the perfect choice to make forward. And that's not always clear.
Right, and it also depends for who are you making that choice? Are you making that choice for yourself? Are you making that choice for, I don't know, your colleagues? Are you making that choice for a family? So a decision, you have like a good decision, which is different than the right decision, which is different than the fitting decision. And I suppose it also depends on how one perceives what the correct decision is. So, the right decision could be about following the rules. It's very clear, I have to do this because that's what the rules say. The fitting decision could maybe be thinking about the potential outcome of something. And the right decision could maybe be based more on implementing one's own virtues, what they stand for. So it very much depends on the framing that one uses to make decisions. What their compass is. If they're very kind of rules-based, you being based in the Netherlands now and me being Dutch, know that the Dutch are very rules oriented, and this is a way that they also make decisions based on if you follow the rules, you're right, you're correct, you are morally right. While other societies are thinking more about possible consequences on like the outcomes or the impacts rather than just following what rules say.
Brilliant. You further made a beautiful answer even deeper by adding the cultural context. It's context dependent as well. And the fact that what the right decision is a loaded term. It could be different based on different stakeholders' perspective. And indeed, all of that makes a leader, any professional, any human being grappling with a decision, it can make that situation feel very complex. Another beautiful and deeply resonant thing you said is the second part of your answer, where you said organizations very much feel, we anthropomorphize organizations too, don't we? We feel like they have a feeling of goodness or not. And sometimes when one is a passionate professional, sincere, giving their all, giving their best at their work, you feel a sense of loyalty, a sense of commitment, a sense of expectation of equal passion, equal giving from the organization. And when they don't play along those lines as expected, or if you feel like an organization you previously felt very aligned with in terms of values is diverging, even though it's a collection of human beings, sometimes you can very much feel like the organization itself is behaving badly. I think how you pointed that out is so powerful, because I look around me today, Isabel, and there's layoffs by the thousand, sometimes overnight. And it feels through the toughest times, professionals have supported their organizations and given their best. When the organization needs to cut costs and be lean for survival, the very people who make it up and make it functioning, just lead off. And so the deep cognitive dissonance around an organization feeling like it's not aligned to your values anymore. I know a lot of people are grappling with that. The previous work philosophy of bring your whole self to work, and that your work family is your family, and that you're all belonging to a sense of a unit. Those philosophies have certainly taken a huge dent, particularly post-pandemic economies being difficult. Another thing you said in the same component was not just that sometimes organizations can feel like they have a personality and you attach a certain expectation, but also, and the cognitive dissonance that comes with it, but you also talked about certain sectors feeling more driven by good values. Certainly, nonprofit sector, for as long as I've worked, I've volunteered and committed huge amounts of my time and energy to nonprofits. And the reason why I reached out to you actively when I read about your research online was because this is such an important topic. I feel that particularly nonprofit sectors in areas of work and life where people are very much giving for the betterment of the planet, betterment of humanity or other species, really, there is an even deeper expectation of goodness, of good values, of ethics, and the burnout can be so much higher. The cognitive dissonance can be so much starker when people act unethically or organizations show lack of integrity or lack of alignment with stated values. They do not walk the talk. And so the research that you are doing and your pursuits through your PhD, and I know the work that you do now, are so pivotal. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
No, I completely agree with you when there's a sense of cognitive dissonance or a sense of an emotional reaction, if you will, when our values are aligned with those of the organization. I mean, to the extent that one has the privilege of choosing where to work, and people work in the nonprofit sector, people tend to work for organizations whose values are very similar to their own. Because otherwise, why would you work there? So if my position was, for example, pro-abortion, I would not be working in a nonprofit that is anti-abortion, for example, because my values don't align with that. So that can also be glorified in one way. This is what I found during my PhD research as well, in the sense of your own values can get flamed by the goodness of what your organization is doing. Like, it reflects back on you, right? You think that you become really, really good because your organization is doing so well, creating like a halo effect. And that can also be reinforced even more within the organization itself, because if I'm good and you are my colleague, then you must be good as well, because we're working together for the same mission. And if this is also halo-wise, I know that's not a term, but if that sense of others' goodness is also idealized, it's easier to turn a blind eye on their unethical behavior. It's easier to give another chance. Also, people can be prioritized over integrity, like implementing ethics, like it can be prioritized over ethics management. I also think that within the nonprofit sector, I mean, in any organization, things can go wrong. Even if there are, codes of conduct or processes and procedures in place, things can go wrong. However, we see that the shock factor for nonprofits is much bigger. So if it's the same type of unethical behavior that happens, let's say, in a business compared to nonprofits, people feel more offended and shocked and disappointed, angry, all of these emotive terms with the nonprofit, especially because of that assumption when we were talking about before, that they shouldn't be behaving badly. They're behaving contradictory to our expectations. You mentioned burnout, and that's something that I've also seen within nonprofits. That to say, I think that can also happen in other organizations as well. But I think one way of also explaining that within nonprofits is if this achievement of the mission is also haloized, that the mission is the end-all be-all for what the organization does. And if the mission is prioritized above other considerations like staff well-being or whatever else, there can be this tendency indeed for burnout, because whatever you're doing, it's not good enough because you still haven't met the mission. So you need to be accessible at all hours of the day. You need to come in on weekends. There is no rest for the hungry, so to speak, because the mission is always there pushing you. So in my research, I found that with the mission, but also this sense of people, that they can be prioritized over other considerations. But the same thing also behind the morals. We were talking about values before, and how we as individuals can relate to the values of the organization, the nonprofit that we work for. If there's also glorification of the morals, meaning that these morals are idealized and prioritized over others, and those can be legal norms, they can also be societal norms, they can be different groups' norms, then moral superiority complex going on, whereby you ignore, disrespect, or break others' norms, thinking that you know better. So, in other words, this glorification of mission, morals, and people can lead to unethical behavior being justified or even encouraged.
And one of the things I also heard from an AI ethicist, she said, the challenge is also defining what are good values and what can a lean, primarily volunteer run, underfunded organization trying to do nonprofit work. The challenge is also which lane to pick, because sometimes a problem can be a super wicked problem. For example, if you're addressing water shortage in a drought-ridden country, you're a very lean, small nonprofit powered by volunteers, you're attempting to fundraise. In this scenario, for example, one of the problems is also if one is attempting to focus on employee well-being and also diverse perspectives around the board of the nonprofit, it can feel challenging. What can we focus on? Should we focus on survival for fundraising? We're only few people with only few amount of hours in a day. Should we look at fundraising? Should we attempt to invest in research to understand how to solve the big wicked problem of water scarcity in a drought-ridden country? Or do we attempt in all of this to focus on how to improve our own internal culture by focusing on bringing in diverse perspectives? Arguably, all are important. And sometimes the challenge of a nonprofit organization is there's just not enough resources to solve all of it. Do you have any advice for nonprofits struggling with these kinds of things? Because oftentimes that's what happens is a strong voice at the board level will say, let us focus on A over A, B, C, D, E, F. And that can
Right.
sometimes feel that that's a dominant perspective, not addressing other perspectives of perhaps important stakeholders too. Do you have any advice to offer to nonprofits perhaps thinking about these things?
No, that struggle is very real, and that struggle is inherent to nonprofits. With nonprofits are dependent on others for their resources. And this sounds like a paradox, but in order by excluding, you actually can include more, because with limited resources, yes, you are forced to make these decisions about what do we focus on, and by focusing on less, but you're able to do one thing arguably better. So you're to exclude, you're actually including the element that you are working with at that moment better. But it's priority, and of course is the question too about, do you fundraise based also on what the donor would like you to do? Because there's also an ethical question. If the donor says, you were referring to water sanitation, water sanitation, if the donor says you can do this, but also let's say education, to what extent do you then drift from your intentional mission to accommodate the donor? Or are you more conscious to fundraise from particular donors who might give you unrestricted funding and allow you to implement as you see best? So these are also decisions that nonprofits have to face. Like, where do you want to get your money from? Because this has implications too on how that will be used.
Powerful, powerful. As an expert on ethics and specifically a researcher focusing on ethics in the nonprofit sector. What are your observations on real-world ethical dilemmas most relevant to nonprofit boards today? And what is your advice to them in those situations?
Maybe this sounds very academic, but we don't know enough about it, which is what has led me to find this nonprofit ethics lab at the Gradel Institute of Charity at Oxford University. Yes, of course, we know that nonprofits at various levels, boards, executives, face their own dilemmas, but they are rarely accessible in the public to begin with. And I think that also comes back down to that assumption of, because these are so-called morally good organizations, they don't face ethical challenges, which is, of course, a naive way of thinking. So in other words, they're not made publicly available because of potential scrutiny against the organization or stigma. But they're also not used for training or teaching purposes. So if we look at, for example, in business schools, how much time is dedicated to researching, teaching students, and discussing business ethics? If you compare that to nonprofit students get a tiny fraction of attention on ethics. And so that's one thing. I don't think we know enough. And to the extent that ethics is discussed within nonprofit studies, it's very much borrowed in from business ethics. So there's also this assumption that just because business ethics, let's say, says that a code of ethics works, we assume that it also works in the nonprofit sector. We are a different type of organization. We have a different role and positioning in society than business and than governments. But how ethics is understood and spoken about and discussed and trained on is we're kind of borrowing from public administration in terms of values and implementing values. And we're also borrowing from business in terms of how they consider and actualize ethics management. Yet we haven't been having that conversation in nonprofits, both in practice, but also within academia, to see if we are a distinct sector, should we not be thinking about our ethics as distinct as well? So this is also the intention behind the lab, to have conversations on this. Like if we're talking about regulation, should the same regulation or accountability standards apply to nonprofits as they do to business, for example? Because you're assuming then that the organization are black boxes. We fail to then take into consideration their inherent characteristics, what makes them unique, and their also unique positioning in society. So the same thing belongs to so this is a conversation that is ongoing. It's starting and it's ongoing. And the intention is then to indeed understand like what ethical dilemmas are unique to our sector, and how can we indeed make decisions on these ethical dilemmas. It's not to say that all of the ethical dilemmas are unique. Of course, there will be various dilemmas that various other organizations can face, but there might be some that are unique to our sector as well. And being able to have conversations about them and to know about them can then help mitigate the risk for its leading to a dilemma, right? If we can already take it into consideration in our management governance structures, if we are aware of potential risk in the future.
Yeah, that's powerful. What I'm hearing from you is that it is an under-researched area. The challenges unique to nonprofit. You're acknowledging that there is so much diversity and unique footprint, unique profile of each nonprofit organization as well. I also like the phrase you used, which is morally good organizations, which I think is a great nuance, because I noticed that in different geographic regions, there is an acknowledgement and an observation of the limitations of your traditional nonprofit organization. For example, in many regions, Isabel, in terms of law itself, they can be quite opaque, quite difficult to maintain. and quite obscure in understanding how they can, for example, fundraise, how they can bring in partners, how they can operate beyond a certain country where they're headquartered. For these reasons, in different regions, different hybrid vehicles have come up in terms of entities. I mean, famously, we have the B Corp from the US that has become a great pioneer in terms of morally good organizations. They are both the idea that an organization can be profitable and yet be aligned to values. I also know has led to research specifically around B Corps. They run their own B Corp labs that they're putting out a lot of research. What's interesting and why I bring this up is I was based in Singapore for a few years, and there was a Asia Pac response to that need, and there was the B Corp did not yet come there because it was unique to the US, but there as well. What I'm noticing from my lawyer's hat on is that these hybrid vehicles, these hybrid entities, they are attempting to put a little bit of, you talked about ethics with integrity, ethics being the structure, the process, the clarity of process. And I noticed that some of these hybrid entities are attempting to provide that structure, make it a little more transparent, a little more what to expect, predictability and structure to it. What I do notice, for example, jurisdiction, legislations, laws, those are not yet fully clear. That's one thing that I want to bring up in our conversation, build upon what you just said, that nuance of higher purpose organizations, morally good organizations, and the lack of structure, and how each organization can have a unique problem, how this is under researched, and therefore there's no categoric, here are top three dilemmas that Isabel is an expert, she can rattle out to you top three problems, and if you understand those, you're going to be good because it's under researched. The second thing I wanted to bring up in our conversation was one of the things I also notice is happening is most of the time, as a researcher who's trying to look at ethics myself, I think a tri-party collaboration would be very, very good for societies, the government, the corporate sector, and the nonprofits. But those are extremely difficult. They can feel unwieldy. They can exhaust everyone involved. And that's the reason why they don't take off quite a lot. In your research, have you seen any examples that are successful where morally good organizations, nonprofits, governments have all been able to come together to address perhaps some key issues? Constraints, we discussed constraints, we discussed lack of research. Have you seen any successful examples around these kinds of collaborations?
Yeah, also just to pick up on your point about, this phrase of morally good organizations and different contexts, you're absolutely right, because it's not in all contexts that nonprofits or NGOs specifically are considered to be morally good. For example, in Brazil, several parts of Brazil, they are mistrusted. I remember also talking to some Indian friends saying, well, in where they were living, they said nonprofits are also not trusted. And trust is something fundamental for nonprofits because it also allows for them to do their fundraising, for example. And that lack of that perception that they are not good can also be exacerbated when there is one example of unethical behavior. Like we also saw what happened after the Oxfam scandal in 2010 and 11. What kind of repercussions that had on the sector widely. So, if it happens to one, there's definitely a strong ripple effect. And in terms of partnerships with governments, I think it very much depends on context again, because sometimes nonprofits are like the government's service delivery arm, if you will. In others, you want nonprofits to be fully independent, right? And one of the characteristics of nonprofits is that they are private, meaning that they have, in principle, the autonomy to create their own mission, independent from the political ideology of the governments. And you need organizations like that as well for advocacy purposes. You need organizations as well to bring kind of a mirror to civil society about what is wrong and what needs to happen. But like successful, I don't have any concrete names, but if you look at these grand sustainable development goals, government contributes towards that, business contributes to that, nonprofits contribute to that. So in that sense, it's a shared mission, all working for the same purpose. In terms of partnership as well, you see a lot of corporate social responsibility where businesses invest in nonprofits. It's almost like sometimes it can be considered to be like a polluter's tax, that the company would then invest in, fund, or share some of their resources with nonprofits to allow them to operate. But we need all three of these organizations for a healthy society, healthy democratic society, I should say.
I love that you're talking about some of the things you say are so profound. The fact that, in fact, many times nonprofits can be the delivery arm of the government, and sometimes the nonprofit sectors in such partnerships, public-private partnerships, serve as a mirror to organizations through CSR, for example. Thank you so much for bringing that up. You talked about Oxfam and the ripple effect. One of the things a lot of nonprofits worry about as well is the perception. A great example would be Patagonia was a B Corp organization, Ben and Jerry's, and even when such organizations attempt to do something positive in their assessment. For example, Patagonia gave away all of their shares and made all the employees shareholders, or when Ben & Jerry attempts to be entirely nonprofit in their running, public scrutiny, with good reason. There's a reason why public scrutiny has been mistrusting, as you called it out, lack of trust. There's a reason for that. It didn't just one day show up. Lack of trust from the public. Lack of trust and excessive public scrutiny and echo chambers in social media and digital world means that any negative thing is magnified and amplified. And all of this means that when I'm working with nonprofit boards too, they're so anxious and paralyzed by not wanting to do anything bold, and they take very, very cautious, minute steps forward, which slows the progress down. But the argument I often hear is we have had a pristine reputation and a storied history of doing good work in the community for over decades. This is not just legacy of this generation, but previous generations too. So we cannot afford to take any risks with the reputation. This anxiety I'm seeing quite noticeably in a lot of boards now. Also advocacy and public cancellation spilling over from the US, where it's been a lot more active. Now there's an anxiety that that ripple is going to spread to Europe too. And there's a lot of, therefore, caution around, can we put the statement out on our website? How will it be read? Can we be held accountable to it? Will we be cancelled in the future for some unforeseen reason? Around this caution, do you have any advice for nonprofits? There's anxiety around trust, losing trust, being cancelled due to public scrutiny.
I think it comes back to what we were talking about earlier, that nonprofits are held to a different standard of accounts. At the end of the day, it's a group of people working in an organizational form, just like a group of people might be working in a business form or in a government form. The question is, we should be able to humanize, I think, all types of organizations, and should be cognizant of the fact that there are people behind the organization. So I've seen several organizations, nonprofits specifically, come out in their annual reports, for example, saying, okay, we've had X number of safeguarding complaints come to us. These annual reports are public, and they said, we want our stakeholders to know that we are transparent with you. So, and the fact that there are mistakes doesn't necessarily mean that they need to be brushed under the carpet, but rather it allows for an opportunity to have a conversation with the organization. Is where did we go wrong, and how can we do better to prevent it next time? So I think it's about less fear, just being able to, and then you also see that stakeholders respect that. There's actually more trust. The more kind of vulnerable that one allows themselves to be, I think the more trusting the organization is then perceived, because it humanizes. I mean, certain ethical dilemmas can create anxiety, of course, in terms of, will I lose funding? Will I lose other influential stakeholder groups? But then it's also that deep reflection of, if I do not communicate this, for example, to what extent does an organization make a statement about a crisis situation, even though their mission might not necessarily be focused on that part of the world or deal with issues affecting that part of the world, yet they feel morally obligated to make a standpoint. do you publish that on your website, for example? You may lose funders, but you might also then gain funders, and that is that risk that needs to be kind of calculated, if you will, like the pros and cons of the impacts of decisions around dilemmas. In terms of like the advice, again, it's the luxury of time, but having conversations on dilemmas, being reflective about what is the ethical dimension of this dilemma. We know an ethical dilemma is different than a dilemma. So what makes it and have that ethical components? And having these conversations about how do you see it, how do you perceive it, what would you do, how would you not do it? To also clarify within, that can be at a team level or that could be at a board level, because these conversations also help clarify what the organization stands for. Ethics is about the gray, as we know. It's not about the black and the white. The black and the white people are clear on. The gray is unclear, and that can also change over time. That can change with circumstance, with crisis. So the more that gray is spoken about, the clearer kind of it becomes like a black or a white issue. Like you want to minimize the gray, and then the more minimized it becomes, the clearer people in the organization know what the organization stands for and how to implement that as well. So the discussability around ethics is something very important.
That's really powerful. That's exactly the kinds of things that nonprofits worry about. I think it's beautiful what you said. Think through acknowledging the constraint of time, consider all your stakeholders, and if there's something that feels like a very powerful moment in time with a situation that may not be our main focus area, but it feels like to not respond would be dropping the ball in some manner. After considering all the stakeholders and different perspectives, it's okay to take a stand, and the cards will fall where they may, and maybe some funders will choose to step back when an organization takes a stand, but that's okay, because that'll help you connect to those organizations that are maybe more closely aligned. As with always, I love that your advice is always focused on helping organizations make a call and then move forward, because that seems to be a big challenge, is analysis paralysis. Another thing that you talked about earlier, which is very powerful, Isabel, is whistleblowers. I think whistleblowing, invariably, it's the whistleblower that gets damaged the most. It's a solitary, painful path in any realm, but particularly in non-profit sector, it can feel like it's such a small world that they're effectively silenced, handcuffed, and thrown out. It feels like it's a career damaging thing to further talk about it in public, because it might be perceived as washing dirty linen, especially in, morally, high purpose organizations. What advice do you have for whistleblowers in the field of nonprofit work?
That's a big question. I think it's also context matters, right? So in the Netherlands, there's laws which allow there to be independent people of confidence, if you will. So within the organization, you're not reliant to whistleblow to your boss, for example, or to someone you may not trust, but there are external, independent, trained parties with capacity to then investigate. But in terms of whistleblowing, it's also understanding your organizational context. What would it mean if you were to encourage anonymous whistleblowing? That might mean also harder follow-up when you do get anonymous complaints. But if it is not anonymous, the person who might want to make the complaint might not necessarily feel psychologically comfortable, safe in raising an issue. There has to be also the sense of culture within the organization that encourages speaking up. Speaking up, that encourages also listening, and then being very clear as what has been done with the listening. Not listening for the sake of listening, but active listening and actually doing something what has been heard. And even if nothing has been done, clarifying and communicating why something has not been done, for example. That also inspires trust that whoever speaks up, it has been considered, for example. So there is no one size fits all in terms of whistleblowing. Again, context matters, and there are various dilemmas that can also be encountered through setting up whistleblowing processes and structures. But in general, whistleblowing is not successful or safe if there is no culture that encourages people to speak up.
Yes, I noticed that particularly with larger multinational corporations, for example, in their CSR wing, they're of a particular size and net earnings because of which they fall within the regulations, where they're required to have certain transparency rules and structures in place already. And when you fall within that ambit, it's quite perhaps relatively easier to have some structure and process around anonymous helplines, ethical reporting. In, say, private family foundations or entirely non-profit organizations that can feel very small and run by perhaps a particular founder and their passion and their strength, it can be near impossible for them to comprehend the importance of having such ethical helpline structures or to entertain any dissension at all. I see that quite often, and it can utterly stifle. That's when burnout surge. That's also when quiet quitting happens, when people just walk away because they know that their important and very legitimate call outs are not received well. And what I'm hearing from you is even in Europe, these can happen. With your foundation, Isabel, do you primarily work with organizations, or would such a whistleblower, perhaps a well-intentioned, passionate person working within a nonprofit, seeking some advice, seeking some help, would individuals also be helped by your organization? Are you primarily looking to help and advise only organizations and not individuals?
You mean if the lab the lab would not do investigations into
If someone
whistleblowing?
were
No.
seeking advice?
For seeking advice on, yeah, I guess I'm hesitating because it's still very much in the baby phases. I mean, advice in terms of being able to set up or implement any kind of ethics management infrastructure, yes, and that would include whistleblowing. But to receive complaints or suspicions or advice as to how to go about if you wanted to whistleblow, I am not sure if we would do that. We would, however, can do bespoke trainings. If an organization wanted to know how to create, for example, a safe culture, or how to create opportunities for speak up, or how to create opportunities to have difficult conversations, whereby both parties who are part of that difficult conversation feel respected and heard and safe. Yes, that we would do that. So in terms of what the lab can do, it would be kind of capacity strengthening, skills facilitation, but receiving suspicions or complaints, I don't think that will be that is not our mandate. No.
Of course, that's very fair. And thank you. And that's perhaps dig a little deeper and understand how those who are listening around the world can be, if they're keen to work with you, learn more about your lab, or I'd love to hear more about it. And just so that I can close this point, what I'm hearing from you is individuals who might, so the hypothetical I had in mind is there's someone sitting on the board of a nonprofit that's small, doesn't have any processes in place, and they certainly feel like there is a problem. Whom can I speak with for advice? Rather than burn bridges, I'd like to help this organization, but I'm not being heard. What are some resources, Isabel, that you could suggest for, say, let's say if you prefer only Northern Europe, but if you want Europe wide, if they were passionate, committed board members or leaders of nonprofits facing ethical dilemmas at an individual level, are there resources you can suggest for help?
Again, context specific. So in the Netherlands, you have these, by law, these people that you can go to. They're called people of confidence. That you can go to for advice in this confidentially. There might also be, for example, in the UK, very rich, rich and strong charity sector that would probably on the commissions, charity commissions websites probably have guidance around who to contact and for what issue. It could be that charity regulators would have across the world would have resources on their website potentially on this. But an ethical dilemma can, especially at an individual level, can also be discussed maybe with a peer in a different organization, to the extent that they feel comfortable doing so. Because again, having that different perspective of someone who might be going through the same thing or is in a similar situation or context can provide that perspective.
Wonderful. Is there a peer community that you've observed for nonprofits? But that is a niche community need. I know that if there were something like that, I'd be very interested as well. Have you observed or come across anything like that, a peer community for nonprofit leaders?
Well, we hope that the lab can also facilitate these kind of conversations for leaders, but also with policymakers, with practitioners and scholars as well. So, for example, whistleblowing can be a topic of conversation, and having lawyers involved, having nonprofits involved, having scholars involved who have been studying this, to be able to understand what works, what doesn't work. Sometimes funders also facilitate these communities of practice or these learning opportunities where they bring together their grantees and they discuss their experiences. Not that the donor is necessarily present, but they fund for the opportunity to allow grantees to come together to discuss a specific topic like whistleblowing, to also share their dilemmas. Then you've got these umbrella type NGOs. So for example, in the Netherlands, you have Partos, right? And you have Goed Doelen Nederland that can facilitate these conversations as well. Just mentioning the Netherlands because you were there, but in different parts of the world, you might also have these kind of umbrella NGOs which facilitates conversations amongst NGOs.
Isabel, thank you so much for this fabulous conversation. I know I could listen to you speak for hours more. So those listeners who want to stay in touch with you, maybe invite you back to their organization for a talk or a workshop, and those who are interested in learning more about your lab, can you share with us how to stay in touch with you and follow your work, and when we can learn more about the exciting lab you have coming up?
Thank you, KG, also for the opportunity to have this conversation with you. Now, for those who are interested in the lab and want to be kept updated on its development, and there will certainly be many as we continue to grow, there's a newsletter. So for anybody interested, they can sign up. To sign up, you can go to the lab's site, which is, if you were to put into Google, the Ethics Lab at the Gradel Institute of Charity at New College, Oxford. Then you will see the page with the lab information. People can also follow me on LinkedIn for the latest. That said, I should probably also update my LinkedIn profile a little bit, but I do tend to keep sharing any kind of new events that the lab is doing, as well as anything related to my work via LinkedIn.
Well, I'll have all the links ready and share it with our listeners. But thank you so much for the brilliant work that you do. I loved and learned so much from our conversation. More power to you, Isabel. Continue to do the good work you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, KG. Thank you. Bye.
As we wrap up today's discussion on the human conversation on leadership and ethics, it's clear that integrity and ethics are the cornerstone of leadership. Host Kaumari Gowda thanks you for joining us in this vital dialogue. Before you go, hit that subscribe button and become a part of the community dedicated to ethical leadership. Share your thoughts and continue the conversation with #TheHumanConversationPodcast.